Thank you for joining us. Could you please state your name, where you're from, and what you do?
I'm Faith Gemmill. Faith Gemmill, Nets Aigwichin, Pit River, and Wintu, and I'm from Bushreich O, Arctic Village, Alaska, and I'm the Executive Director of Resisting Environmental Destruction on Indigenous Lands.
How long have your people been on those lands?
Over 20,000 years.
Tell us about that. How are you able to date that?
Through ancestral knowledge and later through anthropology.
What are the effects of climate change in the region where you live? Tell us about how it is playing out.
The impacts are devastating in Alaska. When I talk about climate change, I say Alaska's ground zero. And we're the canary in the mine. And the canary is dying. The impacts we see are very real. They're everyday. Right, like this past summer, there was over 300 plus fires in the state of Alaska where whole communities and indigenous communities had to be emergency evacuated, and the planes could not even fly in to evacuate the people, so they had to be taken up by boats.
Are fires extraordinary events in Alaska?
Yes, and it's devastated whole communities where all the land around their communities have been just wiped out. 20
years ago, is this something that would happen?
No,
to your knowledge?
No. It's recent, and it's happening more and more in the summer times. We're seeing so many fires, so many communities that have to be evacuated. It's an emergency situation, and there's not enough resources within the state of Alaska to actually address the fires. No personnel, there's not enough personnel, so they have a let burn policy.
Let burn policy.
Yeah.
Can you share some of the impacts on culture, tradition, way of life?
Climate change is disrupting the natural habitat of all the species of animals in Alaska, and the indigenous people of Alaska, we rely on the land to provide for all of our needs. We subsist from the land, so they provide for our food security. And when the animal populations are in decline, it impacts indigenous communities. So there's salmon populations in decline where the people actually have to put their own moratorium in place and not take salmon some summers, which devastates those communities because they don't have enough to survive through the winter. In my community, the porcupine caribou herd, one year the caribou was slowed by heavy snows from going to their calving grounds, which is in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and they were forced to drop their young on the south side of the river. And when that happened, they were crossing the river. The young tried to follow the mothers because the mothers still have a natural drive to go to the Arctic Refuge because that's the only safe place for their babies. All their young couldn't make it across the river and they drowned. We lost 43,000 calves that year. And for the Gwich'in people, we believe we're one heart with the caribou. So for us, that was devastating to our nation. And right now, Exxon is actually one of the companies that's still trying to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And the Gwich'in Nation has been fighting for 30 years to hold the line and protect that place because in our language we call it Ijikwitz'ungwundaigodlit. It means the sacred place where life begins. And that's not only the birthplace for 186,000 caribou, but also it's an important on-land denning area for polar bear, which are already being devastated by climate change. There's 135 species of migratory birds from all around the world that nest in that area, 36 species of fish, and that's where this company wants to drill for oil. And so we need everyone's support on that issue. It's the last 5% of Alaska's Arctic coast that's still protected.
We heard previous testimony describing young people today as the climate change generation. Are there mental health impacts to living with these changes that you can describe?
Yes, because Indigenous communities, when I say we subsist from the land, it's not just about food security. It's about our culture, our spirituality, our economy. Everything we are as a people is tied to the land. And so any disruptions affect us. And the very social fabric of our communities, it affects the social fabric. And so it also affects the health of the people. And when a community is stressed, you see devastating impacts and health impacts in the community. So we see a lot of consequences now in Alaska with social statistics rising that we never seen before.
Can you speak a little bit more about those statistics?
People have to move out of communities, so they're moving into cities, and that means assimilating to another culture and another foreign system, and that's not easy. And so there is a rise in diabetes, there's a rise in other health issues, there's a rise in social statistics. There's so many social statistics in Alaska, and it goes all the way back to the 1970s when Prudhoe Bay oil field was discovered.
Well, I also want to speak to you about the Exxon Valdez disaster. This is one of the largest environmental disasters anywhere in the world, and it took place in Alaska. Can you speak about the impact of that spill?
The impact of that spill was 22 species were impacted. Out of those species, from what I understand, only 2 have been recovered, but millions of gallons of oil were spilled. And some statistics say it was 11 million gallons or 257,000 barrels of oil, which impacted 1,300 miles. And there was many Indigenous communities that were impacted by that spill. Today, if you walk on the beaches in Prince William Sound, you lift a rock in certain areas, there's still oil. And it's still fresh, and it still smells as if it was spilled yesterday. It hasn't been cleaned up. And there's still impacts to this day. The communities that were impacted, the people tried to help clean up the spill, and they have major health impacts today that they are still dealing with.
What kind of impacts?
Upper respiratory illnesses primarily. I have a very good friend, he can't even live in Alaska in the winter because of his chest and upper respiratory illnesses that are still affecting him from the Exxon Valdez oil spill cleanup.
One of the things we know because of these investigations into Exxon in recent months is that as they were researching climate change as far back as the 1970s, they were interested in the economic possibilities this would present because ice would melt. And did you have a reaction to hearing that Exxon saw this as a profit-making opportunity?
It makes me angry. It makes me angry because we are ground zero. Arctic communities are ground zero for climate change. My children are going to be devastated by what's happening. And we have to do something now, and that makes me angry that they knew. And they're still trying to drill in these places like the Arctic Refuge, but also they've already devastated a whole ecosystem in Alaska. And they knew what they were doing. So it makes me angry because it affects my children, their children, all of our children.
Thank you for your testimony today.